The last question I'll ask before we move on to the personal projects is, and I think this might have been hinted at earlier when you listed maybe the three factors that go into our personalities being biogenic, sociogenic, and idiogenic. To what extent does the research indicate that these stable traits are biogenic in origin, and to what extent sociogenic?
I can answer the first one pretty easily, and that is that there are a lot of genetic studies done. I'm so sorry, I have a bit of a cough today. There have been a number of studies done on the calculating the genetic influence on traits. The consensus for years was that between 40 and 60% of the variance in big five traits could be attributable to genetic factors. Most psychologists are hesitant in putting it that boldly, because we know that it isn't a simple direct influence. Rather, the genetic potential is elicited by environmental stimulation, without which it would not emerge and have a consequential impact on the individual's behavior. So that you may have a genetic propensity, but it is only in the context of a precipitating environmental context that it will actually manifest itself. It will otherwise just lay dormant. And so I always like to tell that to my students, because otherwise they may say, but you're telling me it's all my genes. No, we're not saying that. We're saying that there is a genetic influence, but genetic influences are themselves a product of interactions between the biogenic and the sociogenic. For example, whether somebody is lonely or not interacts with a genetic predisposition to depression. They won't be depressed if they don't have the gene, and they won't be depressed if they don't suffer loneliness. That's one example, obviously, that informs us how important it is not to talk about biogenic and sociogenic as if they are in separate silos of influence. They're not. They're constantly in interaction.
To take a very extreme example, you could have all of the genes that would determine an intellect like Albert Einstein's, but if you're raised by wolves, you're not going to solve quantum gravity.
Not quantum gravity. You may be able to pursue other things. No, of course. And I think that so much of human personality research bumps up against ethical issues. I mean, for many people, for example, regard intelligence as a component of personality. It's often linked in with it. There are journals that emphasize the link between personality and intelligence as individual difference variables, things that you can measure about individuals. And once you get into that, you get into some really challenging ethical domains. My own view is that, and this links back to something we talked about earlier, that I was very much influenced by my 2 years at Berkeley when I was working on my PhD by the social movement there. And I have always been concerned with social ameliorative research to see what we can do to improve the lot of the human condition. I don't think all scientists should do that at all, but I personally, and many of my colleagues, regard that as something that matters to us. So we wouldn't want to study aspects of intelligence without looking at the possibilities of increasing cognitive capacity and so on. And so this is where the ethical and the scientific merge. And I think we need to be clear as scientists ourselves what research we want to do and what we want to spend our lives engaged with, and what does not seem to us really worth pursuing, without denigrating those who choose to pursue, let's say, a purely biogenic conception of humans.
Mm-hmm. I've had a couple of interviews on the show that have touched on these sensitive issues involving intelligence and whether or not it's plastic or highly determined by genetics. But in neither of those two conversations did we talk about the relationship between intelligence and personality. So I know that we're still not getting to the idiogenic. That's what I want to get to next. But maybe briefly, what is the relationship between intelligence and personality?
Yeah, it's really more of a journal issue than it is an epistemological issue. So both, unlike experimental psychology that arranged experiments where you shifted the stimulus conditions in a perception experiment, or the social conditions in the social psychological experiment, and looked at the impact on a group of people, both intelligence and personality were looking at how individuals differ between themselves. And so they adopted a very different approach to science. Those who studied intelligence and personality were alike in that they ran correlational studies rather than experiments that were supposedly able to determine a causal path between X and Y. Those researchers in individual differences were more likely to look at and were committed to examining correlation. Now, as we've developed increasingly sophisticated statistical techniques, we're able to impute highly plausible causal models that we can then test. And here's where we start getting into your whole philosophy of science. I am far more comfortable with the kind of explanation that goes on, let's say, in ecology than I am with physics as a model for studying human personality. And the study, and ethology, the study of animals in the wild, the study of patterns of location of elements in different niches. In fact, the whole study of niches and it's feel very similar to yours, mereology, where you're looking at the relation of parts to wholes. All of that is our science, and experimental researchers are not that interested in it because they're trying to look at causal relationships. So it's a different stance towards a philosophy of science. I pretend not at all to have any sophistication in that area, but I have tried to understand what my implicit assumptions are and how they might possibly be wrong. And I'm increasingly convinced that we need to.
That didn't sound good, but it's okay.
I think that may be one of your cats, or could it be mine? No, it was on.
No, that was on my end.
I can't remember what I was saying. It wasn't important anyway. Yeah.